Hey, what's up guys? Icy Soul for Icy Duelist here, bringing you another video of my beginner's guide to Yu-Gi-Oh series. This video is going to teach you guys how to build a deck in the game, and give you all kinds of information about Yu-Gi-Oh decks. So this isn't going to tell you how to specifically build a deck for not going to say if you're a casual player play this, if you're a pseudo player play this. It's basically going to give you the guidelines of how different decks and different play styles of Yu-Gi-Oh are constructed, and then from there, depending on which player you have chosen to be, you can kind of go from there and build your own deck. So jumping into this, we got the deck basics. A Yu-Gi-Oh main deck can be a minimum of 40 cards and a maximum of 60 cards. This is the main deck is what goes in your deck zone on the game mat. Usually, you will want to have no more than 40 cards in your main deck. Even having 41 cards can disrupt your chances of drawing a card you need. So keep that in mind. I mean, yes, there are players that play decks with more cards. Like for example, competitive player Billy Break just won YCS Dallas with a 60 card deck. So it takes some major skill to kind of exceed that minimum, and you kind of really have to know what you're doing when you're building your deck. And even I mean, I'm not on a level where I can go higher than 40 cards. Most players can't. It takes a very, very skilled competitive player to know how to still evenly build and build a good deck with the maximum number of cards. So keep that in mind. Of course, you know what an extra deck is. An extra deck can consist of no more than 15 cards. You can choose not to use an extra deck if you so wish, but it is highly advised that you do. Because the extra deck, of course, is where you keep fusions and synchros and exceeds, and all your face-up pendulum monsters do not count towards the extra deck count. But yeah, it is where you keep your fusions, your synchros, and your exceeds. So, and it's very recommended that you run those monsters in your extra deck, because they are such an integral part of the game now, and if you don't run them, you're going to be at a huge disadvantage. So even if you can't find cards to go in the deck the way you like it, find some generic synchros or generic fusions or generic XYZs that work pretty much with any deck, and put them in just to have them, because it is good to have those at your disposal. Also, a side deck, which we're going to talk about in a second. A side deck can consist of no more than 15 cards, just like the extra deck. And the side deck is really only useful if you plan on playing matches, which a match consists of 3 consecutive duels in a row, in either casual or competitive play. It is definitely necessary in competitive play, not so much in casual, but it's if you want to play a match, it's good to have a side deck, so you can use that side deck for matches. And we'll get into more details about what side decks really are later on in this video, so stay tuned for that. Moving on, a main deck needs to be well balanced with monsters, spells, and traps. The usual standard formula that is used for deck balancing is this: 50% monsters, about 25% of that 50% monsters should be high-level, powerful monsters. Stuff like that would qualify for that would be I know I'm kind of using old school monsters here, but like Dark Magician, what are some other cards? Blue Eyes White Dragon, Red Eyes Black Dragon, kind of like high, not necessarily, don't use necessarily those cards, but just high level powerful monsters like that. A good 4 to 6 of your monsters should be high level. And then 25% spells and 25% traps. To give you guys a visual kind of representation, when building a deck, it's good to consider this. usually run 17 to 21 monsters. This will, you know, help you out. And make sure you run just a small handful of high-level monsters in there, you know, to be your main bosses of the deck. And you can use, they say you can use 8, this is from WikiHow, they say you can use 8 to 15 spell cards and 7 to 10 trap cards. But I wanted to give you guys a little bit of a heads up on spells and traps in regards to deck building, is that lower tier decks thrive on having slightly more traps than spells. So I'd say run maybe like 13 traps and like, you know, it's kind of like balance them out. Like if you are playing a low tier deck, use like 13 traps, and if you're playing a higher tier deck, use like 13 spells. That generally, as it says there, high tier decks work better with having slightly more spells than traps. So yeah, 13 is a good number. That's kind of what I use. And you know, I make sure that, you know, I usually have about 20 monsters, and I have like 13 traps or spells in my decks, and then I finish out the deck with like 7 or so spells. You know, so it is good to have, depending on the kind of deck you're playing, you may want to run slightly more traps or slightly more spells. It just kind of depends on how good your deck really is. So, moving on, I know you heard me talk about the side deck, so let's talk about the side deck for a minute. A side deck is a deck that is kept off the field. In between duels during a match, players can exchange any card in their main deck with any card in their side deck. So you can, and it goes for multiple cards too. So say your opponent is playing Shaddolls, and you don't have like a lightning or shadow imprisoning mirror in your main deck, but you do have it in your side deck. You can take out one card from your main deck, swap it with your shadow imprisoning mirror from your side deck, and you know, the next duel will start with that shadow imprisoning mirror in your main deck. And it doesn't have to be just one card. Like I said, you can exchange multiple cards as long as the side deck is always at 15. You can't, or is always at the number that you started with. You can't take multiple cards from the side deck and then put in less than from the main deck than you took out of the side deck. You know, you can't do that. You have to keep the number of cards in your side deck consistent throughout a match. Like I said, you can exchange cards, but your main deck has to be the same number of cards each duel, and your side deck has to be the same number of cards each duel. But you can exchange them and interchange them between duels. So if you're aiming to be a pseudo or competitive player, like I said, you will be expected to have a side deck. It is very crucial in competitive play, which runs basically off of matches. You don't really have single duels in like big tournaments, or actually really any tournaments for that matter. You don't really have like just single one duel. You know, whoever wins the duel is the victor. It's usually best 2 out of 3 in a match that, you know, determines who wins like a round in a tournament. So the purpose of the side deck is to include, is kind of like I said before with like the example of, you know, Shaddolls, is the purpose of a side deck is to include extra cards that strengthen your weaknesses in your deck. So kind of like stop some, like make your weaknesses not so vulnerable, or exploit your opponent's weaknesses in their deck. So if you notice your opponent's playing something that, you know, you have a card that can exploit it in your side deck, you want to swap that out for the next duel in the match with a card from your main deck. So that's side decks. Quick little crash course on side decks. That's really all there is to know about side decks. So now you heard me mention about tiers, like deck tiers, in the last slide, and you may be thinking, well, what's that? Well, I'm going to go over that with you right now. So deck tiers are basically what determine like a ranking of, you know, how good a deck actually is, and these are the different deck tiers. And tier 4, which are just old, unbalanced, generally just all around bad decks. Like, you know, they're just trash decks. Don't expect to win with these decks often, if at all. I mean, they're just the bad decks. Kind of just like not really following any of the guidelines that I gave you here. You know, just kind of throwing cards together. Like, for example, I've seen pictures like of people who post deck profiles, and it's all kind of cards that were used in the Yu-Gi-Oh anime, like by the main characters and stuff, and they don't really work together good in decks, and just kids come up with these deck profiles because they just like, oh, I'm just going to use this card that Kaiba used, and this card that Yugi used, and this card that Joey used, and put them all in the deck and think it's going to work. It doesn't. So, you know, the tier 4 decks are kind of just the horrible, bad decks. Tier 3, which my Dark Girlfriend's deck would kind of be considered tier 3, are balanced, functional, and average, but not able to beat the higher tier decks consistently. Very rarely, like once in a blue moon, will a tier 3 deck beat one of the higher tiers. It is quite rare. Other tier 3 decks and definitely tier 4 decks they have no problem against, but as kind of with all these decks, the higher you go, the harder it is for them to beat, you know, the higher tier, but it's also easier for them to beat the lower tiers. So, you know, that's kind of how that goes. Tier 2 is your better than average and very consistent deck, and it's able to beat most decks that exist, because tier 3 are a large majority of decks. So they're able to beat most decks, except decks in the higher tiers, as I said. Tier 1.5 is kind of a new thing, because kind of like recently players have decided that there are some decks coming out that are better than tier 2 but not quite tier 1, and these are what they call tier 1.5 decks, and they are extremely good decks that can go toe-to-toe with tier 1 decks, but aren't always successful at beating them. They don't have as high of a success rate as the tier 1 decks do. But they can actually battle the tier 1 decks and sometimes win. And it's, you know, it's a pretty fairly matched contest in that. Tier 1 decks, of course, are the best decks in the game to play. Usually only a small handful of tier 1 decks exist in each format. They provide consistent wins for almost any player that understands the deck's mechanics. For right now, like the top tier decks right now, tier 1 decks are Burning Abyss, and I guess you could also kind of say Satellar Knights, I would guess you could say, and Shadal's are kind of tier 1.5 right now. So that's tier 1, and then of course there's the theoretical, this isn't official, but there's the theoretical tier 0. And I personally classify tier 0 as just unfairly consistent decks. Like, these decks are too good. And like they're win condition decks, like Exodia decks, Final Countdown. You know, the deck cards like You Win the Duel, and it's like, you know, they just stall and just play. They ride on like a single effect or a couple of effects to just basically enter a win condition and win the duel, without actually really playing the game the way it was meant to be played. So yeah, tier 0 is just kind of like, it's so good it's bad, pretty much, you know. That's how I classify tier 0. So I remember me telling you guys in the monsters video that types and attributes would play a role in deck making. Well, let me tell you about that. So monster types and attributes come into play when building your deck. Non-archetype decks usually are formed around 1 or 2 monster types or attributes and a specific play style. So if you are going to use a non-archetype deck, it is recommended that once you decide on what type or attribute you want for your monsters, a majority of your deck should support your chosen type or attribute with card effects specific to that type or attribute that reflect the playstyle you want for the deck. For example, you know, if you wanted to play with dinosaurs, you know, make all, or most, if not all, of your monsters dinosaur type, and then find like cards like Jurassic Impact, you know, that actually like work with dinosaur cards. That's basically what types and attributes are kind of for. And plus, not only do they are they really meant for you, you know, and to help your deck, but they also can be exploited for your opponent's deck. You know, if you kind of have an idea what your opponent's going to be playing, you can exploit what their types are and their attributes, and shut them down with their decks. So, you know, just keep that in mind. That's kind of the biggest way that types and attributes come into play in the game. You know, from helping your deck to hindering your opponent's deck, pretty much. So, and of course it says here, types are usually more supported than attributes. They do have some good cards for supporting or like hindering attributes, but for the most part, it's types that, you know, that get the treatment for like card support and whatnot. So, moving on, we have archetypes. Now, I know you heard me mention like about the through you know, the building a deck with the types and attributes. You heard the word archetype. Well, what is an archetype? Archetypes are special sets of monsters, spells, and traps that all work specifically with other monsters, spells, and traps within the same set. They often share a common first half of the card name, and they are the most supported cards from Konami as well as from the player base. Konami has lately taken, instead of just creating single cards here and there, you know, that can work in almost any deck and you just kind of have to build it right. Nowadays, what Konami does is they build entire archetypes, you know, with several, like a couple dozen cards that, you know, work with each other. And these are kind of the cards that, you know, make it into the competitive play, pretty much. I mean, I don't think I've ever even heard of a player going to a big event with you know, a tier 3 deck that he kind of just melded together and you know, with different stuff and made it work. I don't think I've ever heard of that. But tier 2 and tier 1 decks usually revolve around archetypes. Because, you know, they are very consistent because, you know, they all work with each other. And each archetype usually has its own special engine, which is the optimal way the deck functions. So let's look at some archetypes, shall we? We have Madolches. Madolches are neat little cards that are kind of like based off of parodies of like French and Italian desserts, which is kind of neat. And I kind of, although Madolches are kind of annoying to play against, I do think they are kind of a cool idea for an archetype. And so, to show you guys, like, tell you guys what Madolche is, you got like Madolche Majoli, Madolche Queen Tiramisu, Madolche Hoot Cake. As you see, they all kind of start with the word Madolche because they're all part of the Madolche archetype, and they kind of all work with each other. And this is one thing with Madolches. Madolches is like actually a perfect example of archetypes because Madolches actually recycle like the other cards in the archetype. So, you know, you can keep bringing certain Madolche monsters and spells and traps back to your back into play, basically, and back, you know, into the game. And that's kind of how Madolches thrive. Looking at the next archetype is Ghost Tricks. Ghost Tricks, like pictured here, we have like Ghost Trick Yukiana, Ghost Trick Alucard. I'm not quite sure what the last one is named, forgive me. I don't get into Ghost Tricks that much. But Ghost Tricks, their engine, their special engine is that they thrive on cards being face down. Because when Ghost Tricks are face down, if you have like a special Ghost Trick spell card, Ghost Tricks cannot be attacked when they're face down, and then the opponent's monsters, if they are face down, which a lot of Ghost Tricks effects put monsters face down, Ghost Tricks can basically just jump right over them and attack the player directly, if, you know, there's face down monsters on the field. So, you know, That's kind of how ghost tricks operate, and they're another one of the archetypes. Also, Brotherhood of the Fire Fist is another archetype. They thrive on special summoning level 3 fire attribute monsters. And that's pretty much the special summon for days. They special summon like other monsters in their archetype, and it's just special summoning for days with Brotherhood of the Fire Fist. And also, older one, we have Ojamas. And Ojamas have this kind of unique thing where they restrict the field. Basically, when you activate Ojama cards, they make it so where your opponent's monster card zones and spell and trap card zones are considered occupied, and they can't place anything on them. And usually, they also thrive around, giving your opponent monsters that also, have a very negative downside to them for your opponent, like the main Ojama tokens. Like if they're destroyed, your opponent takes damage. So it's and they're summoned to your opponent's side of the field in defense mode, and they can't really do anything with them. So they're kind of just like ticking time bombs basically. So those are archetypes, and like I said, the current archetypes right now, you got like Burning Abyss, Shadal, Satellar Knights. These are all archetypes that work with each other and are doing pretty good in the game right now. Finally, for the last topic I want to talk about is, well, how do you buy decks? If you're playing using an online duel simulator, which we'll be making another video telling you guys how to get into some of these online duel simulators, you do not need to buy any cards, since every single card ever printed is available for you to use virtually for free. So if you're playing just online and you're not planning on playing in the actual real-life TCG with the real cards, don't even worry about it. Everything's available to you for free. You won't ever have to buy a card ever. But if you're playing with the TCG, there are 3 ways that you can buy decks, and I'll show you guys each of them. The first way is to buy a official Konami starter deck at your local department store, card shop, or online retailer. I have a couple ones pictured here. This one's a really old one. This is from Yu-Gi-Oh! GX, but it's a starter deck of the character Jaden Yuki, and this is kind of one of the more recent ones. The starter deck Dawn of the Xyz. This came out like when Yu-Gi-Oh! Zexal, the anime Yu-Gi-Oh! Zexal came out, which it just kind of ended. So this is also kind of still old, but you get the picture. They'll usually have like a starter deck based around the current anime that's going around. And like right now, they do have the TCG Yu-Gi-Oh! Arc V starter deck available for purchase. I actually picked it up myself. That's how I was able to get these pendulum monsters and learn how pendulum summoning works basically. So you can go to like Walmart, Target, any place like that, and you'll usually find like the latest starter deck to buy from Konami. Now, of course, these aren't gonna be decks that you have created, but it does give you a pretty good way to get into the game immediately with your own deck, and it makes the game accessible, and that's basically all there is to say with starter decks. Another way you can buy decks is you can actually buy pre-constructed decks from other players, either in person, at a locals or something, or online. You go on eBay and type in like basically any archetype you can think of, and somebody will probably have made a deck for it that they are trying to sell. Like for example, like here is a picture from eBay I got of somebody selling a Mermail deck that they have made, fully sleeved and everything. It's a pre-constructed deck that somebody is selling online, and eBay is definitely a good place to go to get those. And finally, the third way is to create the deck yourself using an online duel simulator, and then buy all the cards you need online. 2 of the sites that I like to use to buy cards, of course I'm not getting paid by either of these sites to endorse them or anything, but it's toywiz.com. I love using Toywiz. That's pretty much where I buy all of the things that I open for you guys on this channel. All the openings I usually buy through Toywiz, because they're really close to me and they ship pretty quickly, so and their shipping isn't really that outrageous, so I use Toywiz for a lot of the openings on this channel. And Yu-Gi-Oh! Mint's another good site to get like individual cards. So yeah, you can buy like individual cards through these retailers, and there's other ones like Ideal 808, Strike Zone, Troll and Toad. So there's definitely some options for you if you are looking to make your own deck. But I guess that's it for the deck tutorial. If you guys have any questions, make sure you leave them in the comments below. And as always, it's Icy Soul for Icy Duelist, signing out.